This is David Dubal, and this is Program 2. This is Beveridge Webster month in a way because I have programmed throughout the format many of his playing on various records. Last week we had a program. This week we will continue searching out more of the great mind of Beveridge Webster. I've always been in awe of him because he stands as the kind of musician that is always needed. I think I once said that Beveridge Webster is one of the great musical minds produced by this country who just so happens to be a virtuoso pianist. And yet, Mr. Webster, the piano is an object of such love for you. You are a fire-eater pianist. You're a virtuoso, you're a poet, and all of the literature attracts you. Would you have ever considered being a conductor, a singer, a cellist, or were you born for the piano?
No, well, I think as much as I can recognize, I think I was born to play the piano. I've for 2 years, when I was 10 and 11 years old approximately, I studied the violin for 2 years, and my teacher thought I was very good. And I think, as I remember, my chief inspiration was I'd heard Jascha Heifetz play in 1918.
So he was very young, Heifetz.
That was his first year in America. And I was 11 years old. And I think Heifetz must have been just about 21, maybe less. And to this day, I can never forget the way he played the Tchaikovsky Concerto with the Philadelphia Orchestra and Leopold Stokowski conducting. So I thought I might become a violinist as well. And I used to give little concerts in my own room, in my mother's room, pretending I was Heifetz. And one time, I soon gave up the idea that I might become as good as Heifetz. I had too good an ear to fool myself very long on that count.
A lot of violinists decided that they wouldn't be as good as Heifetz.
Yeah, I've never forgotten the sound of that violin and the way he played that piece, and then many times later. But it was such a revelation. I'd never heard. And my father said that I'd asked him sometime after that. I asked him. I said, "Daddy, why do all other violinists play out of tune?"
So perfect is his intonation.
So only my only other experience was in conducting. I conducted a toy symphony in my father's conservatory. It wasn't the famous Haydn. It was by Romberg, which I guess is also fairly well known. And my brother was the leading second violinist, and my favorite girl, my girlfriend, played the nightingale. You know what the orchestration is,
yes.
Of course, with quails and nightingales and rattles and things. And I remember conducting one day. My mother and father had in their room a very broad, long bench. I think it was for clothes and things. And I apparently went through a big concert of conducting imaginary. I think I conducted the Mozart G minor symphony by heart. And the funny thing was the shades were all up, and a woman called, an old friend who also taught piano in my father's conservatory, called the next morning and said she had enjoyed the concert very much. She knew what I was doing.
Oh, that's charming. Beveridge, I'll ask you your opinion, I can't resist doing this, of various pianists that you may have heard in your life. I'll speak of a French pianist now. You know, you were the first American to win the first prize in piano playing at the Paris Conservatory. Am I right?
That's historically correct, I think.
Well, the Paris Conservatory was a wonderful institution when you were there. Is it still good, do you know?
I'm sure it is, yes. I'm sure it is. The thing I didn't even realize until years and years later was that it didn't cost my father anything because tuition was free. Of course, a government-sponsored institution. It still is.
Well, and it wasn't easy getting in, though, as a foreigner to the Paris Conservatory, was it?
Well, I don't know about easy. I had no trouble.
Yeah.
And I've been often told I still am the only pianist who got first prize there. I don't know how much that means after all these years. But anyway, I remember, I think that the total number of students per class, as I remember, was 15. And I think there were 2 foreigners allowed per class.
That's right. That was what the quota was. Guillermo Novaya studied with your teacher before you did, and his name is Isidore Philippe, who studied with, my goodness, he studied, I think, with Stephen Heller.
He also, because he studied with Matthias, I'm a grand pupil of Chopin.
Well, that, of course, is a distinction, but tell me about...
maybe it's great-grand pupil, isn't it?
Yes, great-grand. He was also a teacher at the Paris Conservatorium, Matthias. But yeah. The experience with Philippe was quite important in your development, wasn't it?
Yes, and it's interesting, since you mentioned Philippe and Novaes, I want to tell you, if I have time, a little bit about how that happened. Because my father had been somewhat more Germanically trained than by the French. And he had decided he was going to pull up and leave the United States, and that he would take his family to Europe. And at that time, my sister and brother and I were feeling quite patriotic after World War I.
Mm-hmm.
And as my father said, won and lost. And soon after that, we heard Guiomar Novaes play at the Carnegie Hall in Pittsburgh. She had just left Philippe, or very, very recently.
Mm-hmm.
I remember playing in a very beautiful blue velvet gown and playing the Chopin B minor sonata marvelously. And my father began to delve around. He thought, well, maybe we don't have to go to Germany. So he found out that Guiomar Novaes had studied with Isidore Philippe. And he said, well, maybe that wouldn't be such a bad idea to look into this. It showed how broad he was and flexible in his intellect.
Yes.
And another wonderful thing I think I want to bring in, because it's so typical, that my brother and sister and I never went to school.
Mm-hmm.
We always had a so-called governess who was also a piano student of my father's, and she came to drill us through German verbs indefinitely for a number of years, and I can still recite them for you if you have time. It will take a long time.
We'll do it later, yeah. We'll do it after the program.
And anyway, this was quite marvelous, because my father said, well, we'll go to France.
Oh, great.
So he told the German girl that her services were no longer required, and he brought in this French woman with sort of two big buck teeth that stuck out, and she wasn't very beautiful to look at, but she sure taught us French. And, she taught us, I think my father must have slipped her the word, let's give them a little knowledge of French and not just verbs and things, some language and speech. So she did. Mm. And she did it so well in a few months that we were somewhat at home speaking French when we got there into France.
How wonderful. So your father came with you.
Yes.
Of course,
so
you were a young child.
The whole family. We really...
he left the conservatory, so to speak? Yeah.
He left, he told me later that he had left legal protection for the name, Pittsburgh Conservatory of Music.
Uh-huh.
And I had often suggested to my brother later that I thought we might think of doing something like that, reviving the name, because it had a very fine reputation.
Yes.
And my brother never fell for it. He remained a private teacher all his life. Yeah.
Beveridge Webster is my guest, and we are going to hear on this program music of Schubert, Brahms, Schumann, Bartók, and Ravel, and we're going to begin with a recording of the first movement. Of course, he's recorded it all, of the Sonata in C minor of Schubert, Opus Posthumus. Beveridge Webster, the pianist. You have just heard the Sonata in C minor, one of the posthumous sonatas of Franz Schubert, the artist Beveridge Webster. Mr. Webster will be back with me to discuss more about his great career right after this message. This is David Dubal, and I'm honored to have as my guest Beveridge Webster, great faculty member of the Juilliard School. You've been there for many years, haven't you?
Since I might make the same mistake I made earlier to say since 1846, but I guess 1946
1946, and you have been very well loved there.
Mm-hmm.
Beveridge, we just heard you in a Schubert sonata. You recorded all of the Schubert sonatas. You were, in fact, one of the first Americans to play regularly the Schubert sonatas. The first recital I ever heard you in, you played the G major sonatas divinely.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to those records?
Well, what happened to those records? They were done for MGM. I did not only all the regularly known sonatas, but a lot of excerpts and unfinished ones. And this only one was released.
The one we have here, we just heard.
And part of the delicious and painful irony on that one was that the labels were reversed. So every time you hear E-flat major is the relative minor in C minor and vice versa. C minor is E-flat major. And when I went over to Dover, they made, I think MGM claimed they were going on to some popular program, jazz and
yes.
things, and giving up their so-called serious recording of classical music. And Dover made every effort to buy those records from MGM. They even wrote a letter through their lawyer saying that which I didn't know. They said Mr. Webster is considering litigation in this matter. And I guess MGM escaped and they had a loophole, and Dover felt that they had treated me very unfairly. I also did the two Brahms sonatas for piano and viola of Brahms with Walter Trampler, and those I think were temporarily released and then disappeared.
So, Beveridge, I want to ask this. Where are these tapes of all of this work that you put out?
Well, I guess MGM still possesses them, and I think I have certain, I don't know what I have. I've never even looked into it very carefully. Of course, these were done, I think, in the early or mid-'60s, in that period of time. But I remember being in love with the Schubert sonatas long before I left the United States to go to France, and in France they were not particularly liked or loved.
They were hardly known here.
I know. And it still is true. There's been an enormous improvement and expansion of understanding and playing of Schubert sonatas, but it's taken a fantastically long time.
Yes.
It's still amazing to me how often it dwindles down to the Wanderer fantasy.
Yes, that's the surefire success piece. But I must say that the Wanderer fantasy at times just is too hard on my ears. I love the sonatas.
I love the Wanderer fantasy too.
Schumann is a composer you have always loved.
Mm-hmm.
You have a recording on Dover of the 8 novelettes.
Right.
We're going to hear the E major, the number 7, a piece that just, well, it demands flying octaves, doesn't it?
Yes.
Schumann
with
must...
hopeful landings.
Wouldn't you have loved to have met Schumann? What a man he must have been.
I certainly would have.
The
way you asked me that makes me want to weep.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll never get that chance, at least that we know of, but he certainly was one of the great sensibilities of all time. We're going to hear you now in the novelette number 7 by Robert Schumann. If you just tuned in and you were wondering who the great pianist was in that novelette of Schumann, it was Beveridge Webster. Beveridge Webster is my guest today, and we're going to continue discussing his life, his career, his ideas, and opinions on music right after these messages. This is David Dubal. Beveridge Webster is my guest. This is your 76th birthday. Is there anything that you have missed doing? I just can't imagine. You've played every concerto, it seems. You have played with countless orchestras. You've toured all over the world. Is there anything that you would like to do? Would you like to be a the President of the United States for an hour, or something.
God forbid.
Some crazy fantasy. God forbid. Yes.
I wouldn't wish that on my countrymen even for 1 hour.
Well, there always has to be a president. I just hope there always will be pianists like you.
Well, I just go on with. I think, in a sense, I have certain unlimited wishes and unsatisfiable things going, but I'm happy to go on leading what I feel is a fairly rich life in music and expanding it all the time. And I think helping young people expand their views of music and what's important and what can be done with a wider approach and a deeper understanding. And I think paradoxically, maybe it isn't so paradoxical, but I think very often this restriction that we have on repertoire and so on, not only in our own field but other musical fields, I think it comes from a way back. When we are drilled so carefully, on how to play the first notes and never to make a mistake. And to jump ahead, I've noticed so many times, much later in a student's life than in some of the serious mistakes, what we always call memory lapses, and I think are not always memory lapses, but attributable to other factors, that I've noticed that this, as I analyze it, that this very, very strict and strenuous training to stop when you've made a mistake can be disastrous later on. By that I mean, I can't tell you how many examples I might give you if I could of one very small mistake turning into a disaster. It becomes out of all control, and I'm sure that this is so often traceable to this fundamental reaction which has been so firmly trained and disciplined into the student that even later on they don't even know why they're stopping and having a memory lapse and a disaster build on it.
And then, of course, they may not ever play that work again either.
And they don't realize that a small mistake can pass much better, and very often small mistakes can be done very artistically, and they're hardly noticeable. But if you stop and without even saying to yourself you don't even know where you are, it can be catastrophic.
Well, that's a flaw in this early teaching, especially where you're looking for this perfection instead of the musical pleasure of learning, especially in those years. And there's a lot of repetition and a lot of tradition, and it's very difficult to be a pianist because, of course, now we have recordings, and let's say your own student listens to you play the Bartók Allegro Barbaro on record, and he or she is studying it, and you just get you become iced, your whole nervous system. I can't play it like Beveridge Webster. I can't play it like so and so. It's all there to hear on records. It's even more difficult now to be a pianist. The standards.
Supposing they hear this same piece by 7 or 8 different pianists, and they try to copy them all.
Even worse.
They say to themselves sort of quietly and not very precisely, well, maybe I'd better be influenced in this part by that, and then in another part by somebody else, and this can become a hopeless mess.
The ear is a very imitative thing, and it can do that, and soon you never develop your own conception, and then you start teaching yourself, perhaps, and then this continues. So it's a very difficult profession, music. When you teach, you have very, very wonderful talents at Juilliard, but many of them are coming from different areas, different knowledges, different levels. How do you react to a talent who just has some part of the personality just slightly introverted or is not developed well, and you know that the person is so sensitive that maybe they're not going to make it because they're too sensitive?
No, we have plenty of that. Loads of examples of that. So what is the teacher's responsibility here? It's enormous.
It's enormous.
It has a lot to do, first of all, with maybe not a great deal that has to do directly with piano playing or even music, or whether they get through ear training 3 or 4, or whether they're foreign and they can't quite keep up with their classes
language.
in the language, and this, or whatever their profound or personal problems may be. And this, of course, can be a very challenging and difficult question for the teacher. I can't help being concerned.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know how dangerous it is to interfere.
Mm-hmm.
But I want the student to understand that I'm there as much as possible to help wherever I can be of help in any field or in whatever is bothering them.
It's a very tricky thing to be a great teacher. Beveridge Webster is my guest, and we have played so far in the program Schubert and Schumann. We move up in time to Brahms, and we hear a late piece, the Intermezzo in B minor, Opus 119, number 1. You love this work, don't you, Beveridge?
I certainly do.
Well,
I think it's one of the greatest pieces ever written for piano.
Well, your recording of it is a gift to us, and we will now hear it. Beveridge Webster in the Intermezzo, Opus 119, number 1. You have just heard the Brahms Intermezzo in B minor, Opus 119, number 1, the artist, Beveridge Webster. We will be right back after this 1 or 2 messages. One never knows, Beveridge. It could even be 3 messages, but hold on. We'll be talking together in a minute. My guest, the eminent American pianist, Beveridge Webster. We have heard Schubert, Brahms, Schumann. I think we should hear Scarbo, that devilish piece. Is this as hard as people say? Is it as outlandishly difficult? What did Ravel say about Scarbo?
I don't think he said much of anything. As far as what my answer to that question, which may seem again rather boastful, is I don't think it's as hard as we used to say, cracked up to be. And I point out how important it is in the piece. I think in many ways Ondine is more difficult.
Really?
I'd like to take more time on than we have here, but the first, maybe possibly superficial reason would be that the Ondine is continuous in its difficulty, and Scarbo is not. You have lots of times in Scarbo where the whole middle section where you can, in a certain sense, just do nothing.
That's right.
And I mean this artistically, the way it was happening in the painting. Nothing's happening for a while. Total inactivity. And then most of the activity, even in Scarbo, comes in such sections that if you're very quick in anticipating and preparing, you've got lots of time. You do something and then you do 4 measures of during all these you're not really doing anything much. You're preparing the next. So, as I say, I would like to take longer on that question because it's a very potent question.
Well, you could give a master class on thousands of pieces in the piano literature. The song literature, I mean, there's very little you have not played with your own 2 hands. Beveridge Webster, let's hear your performance of Scarbo, the third of the triptych called Gaspard de la Nuit by Maurice Ravel. The pianist here, Beveridge Webster. This is David Dubal. It's been a great pleasure on these two programs to be talking to Beveridge Webster. Beveridge, let me see. What shall I ask you? Before I wanted to find out your opinions of some of the great pianists, but I got sidetracked with the prize at the Paris Conservatory. Now, did you like Courtaulds' playing?
I admired Courtauld quite a lot. He was a very special kind of a person and artist, and I'd say very difficult to categorize.
He
was, first of all, very impressive in his personality.
Yes.
He was a conductor, as you know.
Yes.
He conducted Wagner opera at Bayreuth. Everything he did was, whenever he could get the person to look at him, he could just transfigure them with his look.
Mm-hmm.
And in playing the same thing, he had this enormous magnetism. I remember attending what we would now call a master class of his at the École Normale, and there was a boy playing the slow movement of the Pathétique Sonata of Beethoven. And Courtauld was walking around the stage, not looking at the boy at all.
Mm-hmm.
But after the first 8 measures, Courtauld swung around as if he might have been seeing him, and he said, no, he says, that's not it at all. He says, this is music which you cannot play with your eyes open.
Mm.
So Courtauld gets him to play it again and again. He walks off,
mm-hmm.
doesn't look, faces the audience, comes back and faces the pianist, and says to him, no, you're still not shutting your eyes.
Oh, wonderful story. He had a great way about him, obviously, Courtauld. Let me ask you about Arthur Rubinstein. Did you admire him?
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so.
Did you love Rachmaninoff's playing?
I admire Rachmaninoff enormously, yes.
Who are the composers you love to practice most, if there is such a thing, such a master?
That's a hard question, I must say.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very hard question. Might I do it alphabetically
Yes,
or historically?
Let's start with Albinus.
I don't know. You could name them all the composers you've named today.
You've never had a moment's boredom with any of them.
No, of course, certain composers, just by the quantity of their work, demand more time.
Yes.
I mean, you start off with Bach's 48 Preludes and Fugues and countless other works, and even if you're not playing the harpsichord or the clavichord, and Beethoven, 32 sonatas plus innumerable other works,
Yes.
not to mention chamber music, which has always been an important part of my life. Just the quantity dictates, to a certain extent, the quantity of time you're going to spend on
Absolutely.
that composer. And I mean, if possible, to some extent, trying to take his whole work into consideration.
Yeah. Yes.
With Chopin, it's much easier because he didn't write much except for piano.
And of course, though, everything he wrote has to be played by the pianist.
Yeah.
It's all good.
And with Liszt, on the contrary, I don't believe it's possible to know Liszt anywhere near entirely without knowing something like his complete work, because he was so various and
Yes.
so extraordinary. And I think, despite his sometimes, with some people, his reputation of writing, loud, superficial stuff, which he did,
Mm-hmm.
but I think he was one of the great innovators.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is misunderstood and underrated.
Yes.
Not that he didn't write marvelous piano music. God knows he did.
Beveridge
And of all kinds, poetic, brilliant.
everything.
You mentioned it.
It was everything. He
Yeah.
had so many possibilities in his being. Every mood, a painting could just launch him off into a work, a fountain, a piece by Chopin, and he would be inspired.
Mm-hmm.
He had so many areas, but
You
now
have only to study his titles to see how general and how worldwide his interest was in
Perfectly.
all subjects.
Perfectly said. Well, we just were discussing Liszt for a second, but let's now conclude with another Hungarian master. I'll bet you're not ready for this, Beveridge Webster. We're going to hear your performance of the Allegro Barbaro by Bartók. just heard the Allegro Barbaro of Bela Bartok in the hands of Beveridge Webster, who's been my guest on the last two programs. It has been absolutely delightful to be with him. He is a treasure trove of knowledge and, in every way, a human being. Beveridge, thanks for coming, and I wish you the happy birthday and thousands of them.
Thank you, David. I had a marvelous time.
You be well.
It was a privilege to be here.
Thank you, Beveridge. This is David Dubal. Thank you for listening.